A man steps into an abandoned backyard and freezes. A pair of glowing eyes lock onto his. A creature, not quite dog, not quite beast, chained to the earth like a prisoner of time. The metal links dig into his raw skin. 5 years of rusted confinement. No love, no kindness, just survival. But then, something happens that no one expected, and what follows will change everything. But not everyone survives a past like this, and not every rescue ends in a happy ending. The question is, will he make it? Daniel Carter never thought his life would change today. In a small town on the outskirts of Oregon, he worked as a canine behaviorist, rehabilitating dogs others had given up on. His home? A quiet property lined with pine trees. His mission? Simple: help animals who had lost all faith in humans. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to find. A single phone call, a desperate voice on the other end, and a case unlike any he had ever faced. The rescue was the easy part. What came after? That's where the real battle began. Because this dog didn't just need saving. He needed to learn how to live again. And Daniel, he was about to risk everything to make that happen. But what neither of them knew was just how much this journey would change them both. The phone rang, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet of Daniel's home. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something in his gut told him to pick up. The voice on the other end was shaking. "Is this Daniel Carter?" a woman asked, barely holding back emotion. "My name is Rebecca Hayes. I work with the county animal control, and we need your help. It's bad, really bad." Daniel had heard this before. He had spent years dealing with animals no one else could handle. Aggressive dogs, neglected strays, cases so severe that most people turned away. But something about Rebecca's voice made him pause. He could hear the urgency, the desperation. "How bad?" he asked, gripping the phone a little tighter. There was a silence, then a deep, shaking breath. "A German shepherd," she said. "We found him in an abandoned yard, chained up, no food, barely any water. We think he's been there for years. His owner moved away and just left him." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The cruelty of people never failed to hit him. A dog, left behind like forgotten trash. He had dealt with cases like this before, but there was something in Rebecca's voice that told him this one was different. "Is he aggressive?" Daniel asked, already mentally preparing for the worst. Another pause, a deeper breath. "It's not just aggression," she finally said. "It's something else. He's not just fighting, he's surviving. He's completely feral. He doesn't trust anyone. No one can get close to him. He's been living in hell for so long. I don't think he even knows what kindness is." Daniel's stomach twisted. He could already picture it. A skeletal frame, matted fur, eyes filled with something far worse than fear. Emptiness. A dog who had forgotten what it meant to live. Then Rebecca spoke again, her voice cracking. "We don't have much time. If we can't help him soon, he won't make it." Daniel exhaled, his decision already made. He grabbed his keys, his bag, his notebook. "I'm on my way." Daniel drove faster than he should have, his hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. The road stretched endlessly before him, lined with trees that blurred into a single mass. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what he knew: an abandoned house, a forgotten dog, a desperate plea for help. He had seen bad cases before, but something about this one crawled under his skin. Years, that word stuck with him. A dog, chained for years, not weeks, not months, years. What did that even do to an animal? What did it take from them? The thought made his chest tighten. He had worked with traumatized dogs before, but they had at least known a touch of love at some point. This one, this shepherd, had only known neglect, had only known the weight of a chain digging into his skin, the isolation, the starvation. Daniel reached for his coffee, but his hand was unsteady. He put it back down. He had to be ready. This wouldn't be like the others. His GPS signaled the final turn, leading him down a road that looked more like a forgotten path than a driveway. The trees grew thicker, closing in like silent watchers. The sky had dimmed, the sun sinking lower, casting long shadows across the overgrown property ahead. And then he saw it. A rusted fence, a broken mailbox, a house that looked as if it had been swallowed by time itself. And beyond it, in the dying light, was a shape. A dog. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the way it stood, rigid, tense, barely moving. A thick, rusted chain disappeared into the dirt, anchoring it to the spot. The dog lifted its head slowly, as if the simple motion took effort, and then their eyes met. A pair of hollow, golden eyes, eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, no hope. Rebecca had been right. This wasn't just a rescue, this was something else. Daniel stepped out of his truck, the cold air wrapping around him like a warning. The yard was silent, except for the faint rustling of dry grass beneath his boots. He could feel the weight of those golden eyes watching him, locked onto his every move. The German shepherd stood motionless, its body taut like a coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The chain rattled as the dog shifted, its muscles tensing as Daniel took a slow step forward. It didn't growl, it didn't bark, it just stared. Daniel had seen fear before. He had worked with abused and abandoned dogs for years. But this wasn't fear. This was something else. This was complete detachment. The dog wasn't reacting out of anger, or panic, or even survival instincts. It was like it had given up before the fight even started. It didn't care that someone new had entered its world. It didn't expect help. It didn't expect anything. Rebecca stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest, eyes filled with exhaustion and helplessness. "He doesn't even have a name," she murmured. "No records, no vet history, nothing, just a ghost in a backyard." Daniel let that settle. No name, no identity, just a shadow of a life that never really began. He knelt, making himself smaller, less threatening. He didn't speak, didn't reach out. He just let the moment stretch between them, allowing the dog to decide what happened next. But the shepherd didn't move. It stood frozen, its eyes hollow, its body stiff. Then for the first time, Daniel saw something. A flicker, a twitch of the ear, a shift of weight, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell him one thing. This dog hadn't given up completely. Not yet, not entirely. But how much time did he have before that last ember of hope burned out forever? Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. This was worse than he had imagined. A dog left to rot, not just physically, but mentally. The thick, rusted chain looked as if it had fused with time itself, digging deep into the hardened earth. The surrounding grass was dead where the shepherd had been pacing in endless circles, its entire world reduced to just a few feet of space. "How long has he been like this?" Daniel finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. Rebecca swallowed hard. "We don't know for sure, but at least 5 years." Daniel's stomach twisted. 5 years, 5 long, merciless years of isolation. The weight of that realization hit him harder than he expected. 5 winters, 5 scorching summers, 5 years of watching the world move on while being stuck in the same miserable spot. No wonder the dog didn't react. No wonder he didn't fight. He had already lost. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "We've tried everything. Food, patience, even a vet consultation from a distance, but he won't let anyone near. He's not just scared, he's gone, gone." That word rang in Daniel's ears. He had worked with traumatized dogs before, but there was always a spark, a sliver of something left to build on. But this dog, what if there was nothing left to save? For the first time, doubt crept in. Could he fix this? Was it even possible? Then, as if sensing the weight of Daniel's hesitation, the dog moved. Just an inch, a single step backward, dragging the heavy chain with him. But it wasn't fear, it was caution, it was awareness. Daniel latched onto that tiny sign of life, like a lifeline. He wasn't gone, not completely. And as Daniel stood, making his decision, he knew one thing for certain. If he walked away now, that dog would die here. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And no one would ever know he existed. That wasn't going to happen. "I'll take him," Daniel said, voice steady. "I don't care how long it takes. We're getting him out of here. Rebecca hesitated. Are you sure? A case this severe? I'm sure. Daniel's eyes didn't leave the shepherd. He doesn't know it yet, but his life is about to change. The shepherd didn't move, didn't react. But for the first time, he blinked. The first challenge wasn't the dog, it was the chain. Daniel crouched beside the rusted links, his fingers tracing the cold, corroded metal. It had been here for years, exposed to every storm, every season. The links had fused together, nearly impossible to break. The sight of it made his stomach churn. The dog didn't move. He stood at the farthest point possible, the chain pulled taut between them. His body language screamed wariness, but there was no aggression, no lunging, just distance. Rebecca stood behind Daniel, shifting nervously. You're not going to try to force him, right? Daniel shook his head. No. If I do that, I'll lose him before we even begin. He moved carefully, pulling out a pair of bolt cutters. The dog's ears flicked at the sound of metal, scraping metal, his muscles tightening like coiled wire. Daniel didn't look at him. Eye contact could trigger a reaction. Instead, he focused on the chain, positioning the cutters around the weakest-looking link. The dog tensed. He knew something was happening. Daniel hesitated for just a second. If he snapped the chain too fast, if the noise was too sudden, it could send the shepherd into full panic mode. And in this confined space, that could be dangerous, for both of them. He tightened his grip. Slowly, steadily, he applied pressure. The metal groaned. The dog flinched. Another press, the chain snapped. For the first time in years, Shadow was free. Or at least he should have been. But he didn't move, didn't run, didn't react the way Daniel expected. He just stood there, as if the weight around his neck was still there, as if he didn't understand what had just happened. Daniel exhaled. Freedom wasn't just about breaking a chain, it was about teaching him how to live without it. And that battle was just beginning. The chain was gone, but the dog didn't move. Daniel had seen animals bolt the second their restraints were removed, sprinting blindly with adrenaline-fueled panic. But this dog, he stood there, stiff as stone, as if his body had forgotten how to exist without confinement. Rebecca let out a shaky breath behind him. Why isn't he running? Daniel didn't answer right away. He knew why. This wasn't just about physical restraint. This dog had been a prisoner for so long that freedom didn't make sense to him anymore. He stepped back slowly, giving the shepherd space. The dog's muscles twitched, his golden eyes darting from the broken chain to the patch of dirt he had spent years pacing. His world had never extended beyond that circle of hardened earth. And now there was nothing holding him back. But he didn't trust it. Daniel had worked with traumatized dogs before, but this was different. This wasn't a dog afraid of humans. This was a dog afraid of choice. Every decision in his life had been made for him. When to eat, when to move, when to sleep. And now, for the first time, the world was open, and he didn't know what to do with it. Rebecca whispered, "What happens now?" Daniel kept his voice steady. "Now we wait." Seconds passed, then a minute. The dog shifted his weight, his paws digging into the dirt like he was testing reality. His eyes flicked to Daniel, uncertainty flickering behind them, before quickly snapping away. Then his paw moved. Just an inch forward, a step so small it was almost unnoticeable. But to Daniel, it was everything. The first step of a dog who didn't know he was free. But there was a problem. He still wasn't coming with them. Minutes passed. The shepherd remained where he was, staring at the open yard, as if it were a trap. No walls, no barriers, no chains, and yet, he didn't move. Rebecca shifted nervously beside Daniel. "We should try leading him." Daniel shook his head. "If we force him, we'll break any trust we've started building. He has to decide." That was the hard part, because this dog didn't know how to choose anything. For years, every decision had been made for him by that chain. His world had been a single circle of dirt, and stepping beyond it was like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. To Daniel, it was heartbreaking, but to the shepherd, it was terrifying. The wind rustled through the overgrown grass. The dog flinched. His ears flicked back. The world was too big now, too unpredictable. Daniel sighed. lowering himself to the ground. He needed to be patient. He had seen it before. Dogs who had been confined for too long sometimes saw freedom as another kind of threat. But time wasn't on their side. The sun was getting lower. The temperature was dropping. And if they didn't get him out soon, the night would bring other dangers, coyotes, exposure, or worse. The fear that might drive him back into his prison. Then the dog did something unexpected. Instead of running, instead of following them, he lay down, right there in the same spot where his chain had been. As if nothing had changed. Daniel felt something crack in his chest. This dog wasn't refusing to leave. He didn't believe he could. And if they didn't change that, right now, they might lose him forever. The dog lay there, unmoving, staring at the dirt beneath him, as if the broken chain still held him in place. The sight sent a deep ache through Daniel's chest. He had never seen a dog refuse freedom before. Rebecca whispered, "What do we do?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He had been in situations like this before, where a traumatized dog was frozen by fear. But this was different. This was deeper. This wasn't just about getting him to leave. This was about getting him to believe he could. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of cooked chicken. He hadn't planned to use food yet. It was too early, too risky, but he was running out of options. Slowly he extended his hand, the scent of the food drifting through the air. The shepherd's nose twitched. His body didn't move, but his nostrils flared ever so slightly. He was aware that was something. "Come on, buddy," Daniel murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "You don't have to stay here anymore." A long pause. Then, the shepherd lifted his head just a fraction. His golden eyes locked onto Daniel, scanning him as if trying to understand something he had never seen before. Then, ever so slowly, he stood. Rebecca sucked in a sharp breath. The dog didn't bolt. He didn't panic. He just stood there. Daniel stayed still. This moment was fragile. One wrong move, one wrong signal, and the dog could retreat back into himself. The shepherd's gaze flickered between Daniel, the food, and the world beyond the yard. His breathing was shallow, his body tense. He didn't trust this. He didn't trust any of it. Then, with a hesitation that felt like it lasted an eternity, he took one step forward, a single step. Daniel held his breath. This was it. Then he took another, and then he stopped. His eyes locked onto Daniel's again, this time filled with something different. Not trust. Not relief, but uncertainty, because for the first time in his life, he had a choice, and he didn't know if he was brave enough to take it. The German shepherd stood at the edge of his world, caught between the only life he had ever known, and the vast, terrifying unknown ahead of him. The broken chain lay forgotten in the dirt, but in his mind it might as well have still been there. Daniel could see it, the war raging inside him. Stay where it's familiar, or step into something new. He didn't rush him, he didn't coax him, he just stood there, giving him the space to decide. Then the shepherd moved, not quickly, not with confidence, but he moved. One step, then another. His paws touched the overgrown grass beyond his prison, and he flinched. The texture, the feeling, it was different. The world beyond his chain had sensations he had long forgotten. Daniel stayed quiet, watching. If he panicked now, everything would fall apart. The shepherd stopped again, glancing back toward his patch of dirt. That small, miserable space had been his home for years. The way he looked at it, it was almost like he expected it to call him back. "Come on, buddy," Daniel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Just a little more. The shepherd's ears flicked toward him, processing, hearing words spoken gently, not shouted. Rebecca held her breath beside him. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered. Then the dog made his choice. With a deep inhale, he took another step, and another, until, finally, he walked past the invisible line that had caged him for so many years. A step toward freedom, toward something he didn't understand yet. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning, because escaping the yard was one thing, escaping the past was another. The dog had crossed the threshold of his old life, but now came the real test, trusting the unknown. Daniel stood beside his truck, the passenger door wide open. Inside was a thick, padded blanket, a bowl of water, and an environment meant to feel safe. But to the shepherd, it might as well have been a trap. He had never been inside a car, never been anywhere. The open road, the rolling tires, the hum of the engine, it was all foreign. His entire life had been measured in rusted chains and worn-out dirt. The thought of being confined in a moving metal box was overwhelming. Rebecca kept her distance, watching anxiously. What if he refuses? Daniel tightened his grip on the leash, but only slightly. Then we wait. The dog had come this far. He had made the choice to leave that yard, but now he was hesitating. His body trembled, muscles stiff as he stared at the truck, processing what it meant. Daniel crouched beside him, setting the leash down. No pressure, no force, just choice. The shepherd's golden eyes flicked to Daniel, searching, questioning. Was this safe? Was this another form of imprisonment? Then the first sign of something unexpected. He sniffed the air inside the truck. A flicker of curiosity, a sliver of trust. Daniel didn't move. He let him process. The dog hesitated, then took a step forward. His paws pressed into the metal step of the truck, but he didn't retreat. Rebecca gasped softly. He's doing it. Another moment of uncertainty. Then another step. And then he climbed inside. Daniel let out a slow breath, his chest tightening with emotion. This wasn't just a ride. This was the first journey of his new life. The door shut. The engine rumbled to life. The shepherd flinched at the sound, but didn't panic. Then, as they pulled onto the road, he did something that shocked them both. He turned his head and looked out the window. Not with fear, with wonder. For the first time in his life, he was moving forward. The road stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar. The hum of the tires against the pavement filled the space inside the truck, but the shepherd didn't move. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his body pressed against the door, as if bracing for something he couldn't understand. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but his attention remained on the dog. He could see the way his breath came fast, too fast, the way his ears twitched at every passing sound, the way his eyes darted to every shadow on the side of the road, trying to process a world he had never seen before. Rebecca sat quietly in the back, watching. He's overwhelmed. Daniel nodded. Of course he was. This wasn't just a ride. This was his first real moment of freedom. And for a dog who had spent his whole life chained to one spot, freedom wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. Daniel reached over slowly, resting his hand on the seat between them. Not close enough to touch, just enough to let the shepherd see that he wasn't alone. The dog's golden eyes flicked to the hand, studying it. Not with fear, not with aggression, with hesitation. For minutes neither of them moved. The truck rolled down the highway, streetlights casting long streaks of gold across the windshield. The shepherd's breathing stayed uneven, his body tense, but he didn't look away. Then slowly, so slowly, Daniel almost missed it. The shepherd shifted, not much, just an inch, just enough that his paw brushed against the seat beside Daniel's hand. It wasn't trust yet. It wasn't comfort. But it was a start. Rebecca's voice was soft. That's the first time he's reached for anything. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing down the emotion tightening his throat. He didn't respond. He just kept driving. Because this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. The city lights faded behind them, swallowed by the quiet stretch of countryside. The air inside the truck was still, yet heavy with an unspoken tension. The German shepherd hadn't moved much. His body still pressed against the door, his muscles still wound tight, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't just scared anymore. He was watching. Every time Daniel shifted his hand, adjusted the wheel or flicked on the turn signal, the shepherd's gaze followed. His instincts, once dulled by years of isolation, were awakening. He was studying everything, learning. Rebecca noticed it too. He's not shutting down, she whispered. That's good, right? Daniel nodded. It's everything. because shutting down would have been easier. The shepherd had spent his life surviving by disappearing into himself. The fact that he was still engaged, still present despite his fear, meant something powerful. He hadn't given up. But then, just as Daniel thought they were making progress, something shifted. A low sound filled the truck. Not a growl, not a whimper, something in between. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. It was the sound of a dog caught between fear and desperation. A sound he had heard only a few times before, when an animal wanted help but didn't know how to ask for it. Rebecca leaned forward. "Is he?" Daniel didn't let her finish. Slowly, carefully, he reached out. His fingers hovered in the air just inches from the shepherd's paw. No force, no pressure. A choice. The shepherd flinched. His breathing hitched. Then, against every instinct, against everything his past had taught him, he moved. Not much, just a shift. Just enough that his paw barely grazed Daniel's fingertips. A silent plea. A broken soul reaching out, not in trust. Not yet, but in the smallest, most fragile hope. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't move his hand away. He didn't say anything. He just let him stay there. Because this was enough. For now, the truck rolled to a stop in front of Daniel's home, the headlights casting long shadows across the driveway. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly, ears perked, but he didn't move. He had never seen a house like this before. For years his world had been dirt, rusted chains, and the cold bite of loneliness. Now there was warmth spilling through the windows, the soft glow of light stretching toward him like an invitation. But he didn't trust it. Daniel could see it, the conflict in his golden eyes. Was this another trap? Another place where he'd be locked away, forgotten? Rebecca opened her door quietly. "How do we get him inside?" Daniel exhaled, glancing at the dog. "We don't. He has to do it himself." He stepped out of the truck first, leaving the passenger door open. The shepherd didn't move. Daniel didn't pull the leash, didn't command him, didn't force him. He simply walked to the front door and waited. Minutes passed. The shepherd stayed where he was, frozen on the seat. His muscles were locked, his eyes darting between the open door, the unfamiliar house, and the only person who had ever offered him freedom. Daniel let him think, let him decide. Then the shepherd moved. Slowly, cautiously, he placed one paw on the truck's floor, then another. His nails scraped against the metal, his body trembling as he considered what came next. His breathing was shaky, his fear was real. Then, in a single hesitant motion, he leapt down. Rebecca stilled. He did it. Daniel didn't celebrate. He just turned and walked inside, leaving the door open. A silent invitation. The shepherd lingered, his paws shifting against the cool pavement. The open air felt too big, too uncertain. But then the wind shifted, carrying the scent of warmth, of something that wasn't fear. The house wasn't calling him, but something inside it was. One slow step forward, then another, and then he crossed the threshold, not because he was forced, but because for the first time in his life, he had somewhere to go. The German shepherd stepped inside, his paws pressing into the wooden floor. The sensation was foreign. He had spent his entire life on rough dirt, his body accustomed to the cold bite of metal and the hard ground beneath him. But this was soft, warm, safe. But safe wasn't something he understood. Not yet. He stood frozen near the entrance, his muscles coiled tight as his eyes darted across the unfamiliar space. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every creak in the floor made his ears twitch. Rebecca barely breathed. "He looks like he's waiting for something bad to happen." Daniel nodded, because that was all he had ever known. The shepherd's eyes flicked to Daniel, watching, waiting for the punishment that never came. He had stepped into new places before, but always at a cost. Every misstep had earned him pain. Every mistake had been met with punishment. Now he was waiting for the consequence of stepping inside this house, but it never came. Daniel sat down on the floor, making himself smaller, less threatening. He placed a bowl of fresh water nearby, its surface shimmering under the soft light. He didn't call the dog over, didn't force him to move. The shepherd's gaze flickered toward it, his nose twitching. He was thirsty, desperately so, but drinking in front of a human, that was a risk. Daniel saw the hesitation and knew this wasn't just about the water. This was about permission. For years, the shepherd had learned that nothing belonged to him. Not food, not space, not comfort. Everything was given at the whim of someone else and could just as easily be taken away. Minutes passed. The shepherd remained still. The water sat untouched. Then finally his thirst won. With slow, cautious steps, he inched forward, his nails clicking softly against the wood, his head lowered, his body still tense, ready to bolt if this was a mistake. His nose hovered over the bowl, and for a moment, he waited for a shout. A hand, a reason to run. Nothing happened, and so for the first time in years, he drank. The moment was small, but it meant everything, because for the first time, he had been given something without pain attached to it. And maybe, just maybe, that meant more would follow. The shepherd finished drinking, but he didn't move away from the bowl. His posture was still tight, his body still braced for something he couldn't name. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that should have felt peaceful. But to him, silence had never meant safety. In the past, silence was a warning. The moments before pain, before the rattling of chains, the scrape of metal against dirt, before a footstep too close, a hand that didn't bring comfort. He had learned to listen in the quiet, to prepare. And now in this strange place with soft floors and open space, there was nothing to prepare for. The silence didn't make sense. His ears flicked, catching only the faint sound of breathing. Daniel's, Rebecca's, his own. Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. He doesn't know what to do, does he? Daniel shook his head, because how do you explain to a dog who's only known fear that it's over? That no one would come for him in the night, that no more hands would strike him, that no more chains would tighten around his neck, that he was free. The shepherd took a step back, his nails tapping against the floor. His instincts told him to retreat to the corner, to make himself small. But there was no corner to hide in, no fence pressing against his back, no chains to tell him where he belonged, and that terrified him. He stood in the center of the room, his body lost, Rebecca's breath hitched. He doesn't know how to exist without being trapped. Daniel clenched his jaw. That was the worst part of all. Not the fear, not the hesitation, but the fact that freedom felt unnatural to him. The shepherd turned his head slightly, golden eyes flickering toward Daniel. There was something desperate in them. Not aggression, not anger, just a question. What do I do now? Daniel swallowed hard. Come here, buddy. The shepherd's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Daniel didn't push, didn't ask again. Instead, he simply laid down on the floor and waited. Because if the shepherd had spent a lifetime believing chains were all he had, then Daniel would wait as long as it took to prove otherwise. Minutes passed, maybe more. The shepherd stood frozen in place, eyes darting between the open space, the unfamiliar house, and the man lying still on the floor. He had never seen this before. No orders, no ropes, no threats, just a man waiting. Rebecca barely moved, afraid even the smallest shift would send the dog retreating. The shepherd's breathing was uneven, his ribs expanding in quick, shallow movements. He was still braced for something. But for what? There were no hands coming toward him. No chain to yank him back. No punishment. So why did he still feel like he was wearing one? Because the chain had never just been on his neck. It had wrapped around his thoughts, his instincts, his very sense of existence. Even now, without the metal biting into his skin, he still felt its weight. His nails clicked softly as he shifted his front paw. Just slightly, barely noticeable. But to Daniel, it was everything. Because it meant he was thinking, not just reacting, not just shrinking back. He was deciding. Then so carefully, so hesitantly, the shepherd lowered his body. Not fully, just enough to crouch, his muscles still tight, his back legs ready to spring if this was the wrong choice. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, he just let him exist. The shepherd watched him for a long time, studying, waiting, and then he did something neither of them expected. His ears twitched, his head tilted slightly, and for the first time since stepping into this strange new world, he lowered his chin to the ground. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was the smallest crack in the wall, a moment of surrender, not to a person, but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to run anymore. Rebecca wiped at her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, because in that tiny movement, the dog who had only ever known chains had finally started to believe, just a little, that maybe he didn't need them anymore. The first rays of morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the quiet house. The world outside was waking up, birds chirping, distant cars humming along the road, but inside, everything was still. Daniel blinked awake, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor. He hadn't meant to. But at some point during the night, exhaustion had pulled him under, and then he felt it. A weight, soft, warm, just inches away from him. His breath caught. He turned his head slowly, careful not to startle him, and there he was. The shepherd curled up just a few feet away, his body rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. He had stayed. Daniel's chest tightened, his mind racing. He had expected the dog to retreat the moment he fell asleep, to slip back into the corner, press himself against the wall, like he always had. But instead, he had chosen to stay near him. Rebecca, who had curled up on the couch hours ago, stirred. When she lifted her head and saw them, her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. Daniel barely nodded, afraid any movement might shatter the fragile moment. But then, the shepherd's ears twitched, his breathing changed, and suddenly, his eyes opened. Golden and alert, they locked onto Daniel's. The room went still. For a heartbeat, everything teetered on the edge of something fragile, something unspoken. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the shepherd see him. The dog's muscles tensed, just slightly. The old instinct whispered in his mind, telling him to bolt, to shrink away, to brace for something that never came. But Daniel wasn't like the others. He didn't reach for him, didn't cage him in. He just waited. The shepherd's breath came quicker now, his eyes darting between Daniel and the open space of the room. He was thinking, deciding. Then in the smallest, most hesitant movement, he let out a breath and laid his head back down. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, because in that moment, it wasn't just a dog waking up in a new place. It was a soul realizing, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The shepherd didn't move for a long time. He simply lay there, his golden eyes flicking between Daniel and Rebecca, his breath slow but cautious. Daniel didn't push him, didn't speak. But then came the real test, standing up. Daniel knew the moment he shifted, everything might change. The shepherd had stayed close while the world was still, but now he had to decide if he still felt safe when things moved. Slowly, carefully, Daniel braced his hand against the floor and pushed himself up. The instant his weight shifted, the shepherd flinched, not a full retreat, but close. His muscles tensed, his paws flexed against the floor as if preparing to spring backward. His ears flattened, his eyes widened. The instinct to run, to escape, burned in him. But he didn't, not yet. Daniel kept his movements slow, deliberate. He stood fully now, towering over the shepherd, but he didn't take a step closer. Instead, he stepped back, and the shepherd noticed, for the first time, his eyes didn't just watch Daniel. They studied him. This wasn't what humans did. Humans took. Humans closed in. Humans didn't give space. But Daniel had stepped away. Rebecca whispered, "I think he's realizing it." Daniel exhaled softly, that this place was different, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a prisoner here. The shepherd blinked, his nose twitched, and then with excruciating hesitance, he moved. One paw, then another, not back, forward. It was small, barely a shift in the world. But to Daniel, it was everything, because for the first time, the dog who had only ever known chains had taken a step by choice. The shepherd's steps were slow, measured, as if he were testing the ground itself. His paws barely left the floor, his body still tense, ready to bolt if the world proved itself untrustworthy again. But Daniel didn't move. Rebecca didn't speak. They just let him exist. And for the first time in his life, he was free to explore. His nose twitched, his ears shifting with every tiny sound. The floor was new. The air was new. The scent of the house carried things he didn't understand. Wood, soap, warmth. But then something stronger hit him. Something he knew. The shepherd froze, nostrils flaring. Food. His stomach clenched, muscles tightening with an old familiar instinct. Hunger had been a cruel master, his whole life. A force that dictated his every action. Food had always come one way, tossed at him, out of reach. A test, a challenge. He had to snatch it quickly, before it was gone, before it was taken, before someone punished him for wanting it. Now it was different. The scent was coming from the counter, steady, unmoving. Not a trick. Daniel saw it. The exact moment survival instincts clashed with hesitation. The shepherd's muscles coiled, ready to spring toward the source, but he held himself back. His eyes flicked to Daniel. Daniel who was watching, but not stopping him. That was new. The shepherd lowered his head, confused. He had always known what to expect before. He had always known the rules of hunger, but here, there were no rules, just a bowl, sitting on the floor, waiting for him, and no one telling him he had to fight for it. Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think he understands it's his?" Daniel swallowed, watching the shepherd, as he inched closer. "I don't know," he said. Because for the first time in his life, this dog wasn't being fed like a prisoner. He was being given something, without conditions, and he didn't know how to handle that. The shepherd's body was frozen, his gaze flicking between the untouched bowl and Daniel. His breath was uneven, his muscles tight. He wanted it, but something held him back. Years of conditioning had taught him that food was a battle. It had been stolen, fought over, dangled in front of him only to be ripped away. He had been starved into submission, forced to obey before he was allowed even a scrap. Hunger had never been a simple thing. It had been a weapon, a punishment, a cruel game that he never won. And now it just sat there, waiting for him. No one was shoving him away. No one was looming over him, forcing him to beg, growl, fight. This wasn't how food worked. It couldn't be this easy. Rebecca inhaled softly. "Why isn't he eating?" Daniel shook his head. He's never had food like this before. At least, not without a price. The shepherd's ears flicked forward at the sound of Daniel's voice. He was still watching, still waiting, still trying to understand. And then, slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward. The bowl didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. His nose twitched, his breath shaky as he lowered his head, just slightly. His body braced for something to happen. A slap, a yank on the chain, a snarl from another dog, warning him away. But the only thing that came was silence. Daniel felt his heart tighten in his chest as the shepherd hesitated one final time, then finally took the first bite. His teeth clamped down on the food, his body still tense, waiting for the moment someone would rip it away. But it never happened. So he chewed, then took another bite, and another, and for the first time in his life, he ate without fear. No chains, no punishment, no battle for survival, just a quiet morning, a warm home, and a meal that belonged to him. Rebecca pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes glistening. Daniel swallowed hard, because this wasn't just a meal. This was the first moment the shepherd had ever been allowed to live without the weight of the past crushing him, and neither of them would ever forget it. The morning light poured in through the windows, casting soft golden streaks across the floor. The shepherd lay by the kitchen table, his body no longer coiled like a spring, but still holding a cautious tension. His belly was full, maybe for the first time in his life, but even now, he didn't quite understand what that meant. Daniel and Rebecca moved quietly around him, giving him space, never forcing anything. They knew this was a delicate balance. Trust wasn't something you demanded, it was something earned, moment by moment. Then came the next step, the door. For so long the outside world had been nothing but suffering, a backyard that had been his prison, the chain that had dictated the limits of his life. He had learned to survive inside that cruel perimeter, trapped in a loop of pacing, barking, but this house had something new, a door that was open. Daniel glanced at Rebecca, then slowly reached for the handle. The shepherd's ears twitched, his head lifting slightly. His eyes tracked Daniel's movement, watching, calculating. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing something he had never known before, a world without chains. Fresh air rushed in, bringing scents he hadn't smelled without a rusted collar around his neck. The breeze carried the scent of grass, damp earth, and the distant call of birds, things that had existed all his life but never belonged to him. And now, he was free to step forward. But he didn't. He stayed frozen, staring at the open space like it was a trap, like he didn't believe it. Daniel took a slow step outside, keeping his body relaxed, his voice calm. "It's okay, buddy. You can come." Rebecca stayed still, her hands curled into fists as she held her breath, but the shepherd didn't move. He simply stared at freedom, and he didn't know what to do with it. The shepherd's eyes stayed locked on the open door, his body tense, his breathing sharp and uneven. He could smell the fresh grass, hear the rustling trees, feel the pull of something inside him, something primal, something deep, but he didn't move. He just stared. The open space beyond that threshold was too much, too big, too unknown. His whole life had been confined to a patch of dirt, just enough space to pace, just enough slack in the chain to turn in circles, but never to run, never to chase, never to explore. He had never chosen where to go. His world had always been decided for him. Now the door was open, but his mind still felt locked. Daniel crouched down, careful not to block the shepherd's view. His voice was low, steady. "You're free, buddy. You don't have to stay inside. You can go." But could he? The shepherd's ears flicked. He inched forward slightly, his paws barely crossing the wooden floor, his head lowering as if the ground itself might vanish beneath him. Every fiber of his being screamed hesitation. Rebecca whispered, "Do you think he's scared of what's out there?" Daniel swallowed. "No," he murmured. I think he doesn't know if he's allowed." That realization sent a sharp pang through both of them. For so long this dog hadn't been allowed anything. Not comfort, not freedom, not kindness. His world had been a cage without walls, a prison built in his own mind. And now, standing in the doorway, he didn't know if he could walk through it. Minutes passed. His muscles twitched, his breath hitched. Then finally, one paw. One careful, trembling step onto the porch. Rebecca let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel didn't move. He didn't praise him. He just watched. Because now, the shepherd wasn't just stepping outside. He was stepping into a life he never knew he could have. The shepherd stood frozen on the porch, his paw hovering slightly above the wooden boards, as if the ground itself might betray him. His breath was fast and shallow, his eyes scanning the yard ahead. A world without barriers, without fences, without chains, but his body refused to believe it. Daniel and Rebecca watched in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was more than just stepping outside. This was undoing years of conditioning, of fear, of believing that freedom was a cruel trick. The shepherd's muscles coiled, his tail tucked low, his ears flicking in every direction. Every rustling leaf, every chirping bird, every soft whisper of the wind felt like danger. He had never been allowed to move freely, and now his mind didn't know how to handle it. His back paw shifted, ever so slightly, like he might retreat. The house was new, unfamiliar, but it was something. A space with walls, with limits, something he could understand. Out here, there was nothing to hold him back, and that terrified him. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "He doesn't know what to do," he whispered. Rebecca's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "He's never had a choice before." The shepherd took another shallow breath, his body still locked in place, and then he turned. Not forward, not toward the yard, but back inside. A sharp pang hit Daniel's chest as the shepherd stepped backward, back into the house, back into the space where he felt safe. Rebecca's hand clamped over her mouth. "He couldn't do it," she whispered, but Daniel shook his head. Not yet, because this wasn't failure. This wasn't him refusing. This was a dog learning what choice felt like, for the first time in his life. The shepherd curled up near the doorway, his body still tense, his mind caught in a silent battle. The outside world had been right there, open and waiting. He had felt the wind, smelled the fresh grass. He had tasted freedom, and yet he had turned back. Rebecca sighed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you think he'll ever go out?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He crouched a few feet away from the shepherd, watching him carefully. The dog wasn't trembling, wasn't cowering. He wasn't afraid of Daniel or Rebecca. He was afraid of what came next. "We don't push him," Daniel finally said. "Not today, but he needs to know that door is still open." So they did something simple, something small but important. They left the door open, not forcing him, not luring him, not trying to convince him, just letting him see. Minutes passed, then an hour. Rebecca moved around the house, tidying up. Daniel went about his day, occasionally glancing toward the shepherd, but never pressuring him, and the dog just watched. His ears flicked toward the wind. His nose twitched at every passing scent. His eyes stayed fixed on the open door. Then, something changed. A soft rustling, a single dry leaf blew in from outside, tumbling over the wooden floor right in front of him. The shepherd's head lifted. His nose twitched, and for the first time in his life, he reached for something on his own. It was small, just a leaf. But when his paw tapped it, watching it skid slightly across the floor, something inside him stirred. Curiosity, a feeling he had never been allowed to have. Daniel held his breath. Rebecca stilled. The shepherd pushed the leaf again, then stood. His eyes flicked toward the open door, and this time, he didn't look away. Rebecca whispered, "Daniel." But he already knew the shepherd was going to try again. The shepherd stood there, his eyes flicking between the leaf and the open door, his body poised between two worlds, the safety of the only life he had ever known, and the terrifying vastness of something new. Daniel and Rebecca didn't move. They hardly even breathed. This had to be his decision. For what felt like an eternity, the dog just stood there, his ears flicking, his breath slow and measured. The wind outside carried the scent of earth, of trees, of possibility. Then, finally, he moved. One paw forward, a pause, then another. His steps were careful, slow, deliberate. As if any moment, something unseen might snatch it away. His nails clicked softly against the wooden floor as he reached the threshold, his head lowering, sniffing at the new world beyond. He stopped, his body tensed, his muscles locked up again, hesitation creeping back in. What if this was a trick? What if the moment he crossed that line, the chain would snap around his neck again? What if stepping into the open meant stepping into danger? The doubt in his eyes was almost unbearable. Daniel clenched his fists at his sides, aching to do something, anything to show the dog that it was okay, that he was safe. But then something incredible happened. The wind picked up just slightly, swirling past the shepherd's fur, carrying with it the soft, distant sound of birdsong. His ears perked. His body shifted, his nose twitched, and in that single moment, something changed. A lifetime of hesitation, of restriction, of fear, gone. Because before he could second-guess himself, before he could let his mind pull him back, he stepped forward. Not just a hesitant paw, not just a shuffle, but a real full step out the door, onto the porch, into a world where he was finally free. The shepherd's paws met the wooden boards of the porch, and for a moment, he froze, his breathing quickened, his body stiffening, as if expecting something, a yank, a shock, the cold bite of metal tightening around his neck. But nothing came, no chain, no restraint, no force pulling him back. His front paw trembled, half lifted off the ground, as his mind fought against the reality in front of him. The weight of years spent bound in one place wasn't something that disappeared overnight. It was still there, gripping his mind even though the chain was gone. He tilted his head, his ears flicking wildly at the sounds around him. The world was so loud, the wind rustled through the trees, shaking the leaves in a rhythm he didn't understand. Somewhere in the distance, a bird let out a sharp call. A car engine rumbled from a nearby street. Everything felt big, open, unfamiliar. Rebecca held onto Daniel's arm, whispering, "He's scared." Daniel didn't take his eyes off the shepherd. He's never felt this before. For a lifetime, his world had been one patch of dirt, one small space where nothing ever changed. Now the whole world stretched before him. The shepherd lowered his head and sniffed the air. He took another hesitant step, his paws sinking slightly into the softness of the welcome mat. Then another. Then his paw met the coldness of stone. His whole body flinched. He recoiled, his tail tucking slightly, stepping backward as if the new sensation was too much. Rebecca's breath caught. Would he go back inside? But then the shepherd stopped himself. He looked down at the ground beneath him, his ears twitching, his nostrils flaring as he processed the sensation. The coolness of stone, the roughness of the concrete beneath his pads. It wasn't bad, just new. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. The shepherd swallowed, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. And then, just as before, he stepped forward again. This time, a little more confident. This time, fully onto the porch. The world was still huge, still terrifying, still overwhelming. But for the first time, he was standing in it. The shepherd stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the ground below, as if it were an abyss. The grass moved with the wind, shifting in unpredictable ways. The dirt was uneven, unfamiliar. It wasn't the hard, packed earth he had spent years pacing in circles on. It was something entirely different. Daniel and Rebecca remained frozen, watching in complete silence. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire world held its breath with them. Would he take the step? The shepherd lowered his head, sniffing the edge of the porch. His ears flicked wildly, scanning the sounds around him. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back. For a lifetime, his world had been contained. Now there was too much of it. The wind carried the scent of wet soil, of distant trees, of a life that had never belonged to him before. And yet, something inside of him stirred. A small, fragile voice, buried deep within him, the part of him that had never given up. One paw lifted, a pause. Then he set it down. The wooden porch creaked softly beneath his weight. He glanced at Daniel, searching for reassurance, then looked back at the open world ahead. One more step, and then another. His front paws touched the earth, soft, cool, uneven, alive. His breathing hitched, his muscles stiffening again. He turned his head quickly, as if expecting someone to pull him back. But no hands came, no leash, no command, no barrier. For the first time in his life, he had stepped onto the ground without permission. His back legs trembled as he hesitated at the edge of the porch. Then, with a sharp exhale, he pushed forward. And just like that, he was standing in the grass. Rebecca covered her mouth, her eyes burning with tears. Daniel clenched his jaw, swallowing hard. The shepherd was outside, truly outside. But even as he stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, one question remained. What now? The shepherd stood frozen in the grass, his breath unsteady, his body still adjusting to the overwhelming realness of the world around him. The wind ruffled through his fur, not the stale breeze of an empty backyard, but the wild, unrestrained air of the open. He lowered his head, sniffing the ground. The scent was rich, layered, so much more than the single note of dust and rusted metal that had filled his life before. This was earth, alive, changing, breathing beneath his paws. Daniel and Rebecca watched from the porch, afraid to move, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter the fragile progress he had made. The shepherd took a step forward. The grass bent under his weight, tickling his paws in a way that sent a shiver up his spine. The sensation was foreign, strange. He lifted his paw as if to shake it off, then hesitantly set it down again. He turned his head sharply at a rustling noise nearby. A bird, not the muffled, distant chirping he had grown used to. This was close, fluttering, unpredictable. His ears flicked back and forth. His tail was low, uncertain. Then came the next shock. The wind picked up suddenly, sweeping through the trees, making the branches sway and groan. The shepherd flinched. His muscles tensed, his breath hitched. Too much movement, too much noise, too much unknown. His body reacted before his mind could stop it. In a blur of panic, he spun around, bolting back toward the porch. His paws slammed against the ground, his nails scraping against the wooden steps as he scrambled to get back to what was safe, known, familiar. But he hesitated at the threshold. His chest heaved, his heart racing. His front paws were back on the porch, but his back paws still touched the grass. Daniel's voice came softly. "It's okay." The shepherd turned, looking back at the world he had just fled from. His legs shook. For a moment, it felt impossible, too big, too much. But then, he didn't run inside. He stayed, and that alone was something incredible. The shepherd's paws remained frozen at the threshold, half inside the house, half outside in the unknown. His breath was quick, shallow, as if the air itself had become too much to take in. He had lived so long in the confines of chains and dirt that the vastness of freedom felt unnatural. Daniel knelt a few feet away, his hands open, his posture relaxed. He didn't move toward the shepherd. He simply waited, letting the moment belong to the dog. The choice had to be his. The shepherd's tail twitched as his ears flicked back, his body torn between two instincts: go back to safety or step into something new. Then a sound, a branch snapped in the distance. The shepherd's head snapped toward the noise, his muscles tightening. Was it danger? A threat? His body quivered as he processed the noise, his instincts screaming at him to flee. Rebecca sucked in a breath, worried he would retreat entirely. But something strange happened. Instead of bolting, the shepherd hesitated. His ears twitched toward Daniel, as if waiting for a signal. Daniel didn't react. He remained still, steady. His presence was calm, unshaken, and the shepherd noticed, for the first time, he wasn't just relying on his fear to decide what happened next. He was looking for guidance. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back toward Daniel, still watching him closely. His breath was still ragged, his body tense, but the difference was undeniable. A step forward. Just one, then another. Daniel exhaled softly, keeping his voice even. "That's it, you're okay." The shepherd's tail twitched, uncertain, but he didn't back away. Rebecca clutched her hands to her chest, barely containing the emotions rising inside her. For the first time, the shepherd had chosen something other than fear, and that meant everything. The shepherd had started to trust, but trust was a fragile thing. It had taken days just for him to step past the porch without panicking, and even then, the outside world was still filled with shadows he wasn't sure he could face. Daniel knew he had to be patient. He never forced the shepherd, never rushed him, but today was different. It was time for his first real walk beyond the yard. The leash was light, nothing like the heavy chain that had once weighed him down. It rested loosely on his back, giving him a choice: follow or refuse. Rebecca held her breath as Daniel took a slow step forward, giving the leash the slightest bit of tension. The shepherd froze, his chest heaved, his legs locked. Something in his eyes flickered, memories of being restrained, of being trapped. His body tensed, as if bracing for pain, but no pain came. Daniel loosened the leash, letting it drop slightly. "You're safe," he murmured. No force, no pressure, just an invitation. The shepherd's nostrils flared, the wind carrying scents he had never experienced up close before. Earth, leaves, the distant trace of another dog that had passed by hours ago. His ears flicked forward. Another step. Rebecca nearly gasped. Then another. The tension in his legs softened, just a little. Step by step, they moved toward the gate. Each movement was a battle against the past, a battle he was slowly starting to win. But then, a loud car passed on the road beyond the fence. The shepherd's body went rigid, his tail tucked, his breathing hitched. The fear returned in an instant, flooding him like a tidal wave. Rebecca clenched her hands. Would he run back? Would he shut down completely? The shepherd's eyes darted between Daniel and the noise beyond the fence. His instinct screamed at him to flee. But then he did something neither of them expected. He turned back toward Daniel, looking straight at him, not at the leash, not at the gate, at Daniel. And for the first time he made a choice. Instead of running, he stayed. The world beyond the gate was a vast, unfamiliar place. The shepherd had spent his entire life in confinement, knowing only the limits of his chain. Now standing at the threshold, his body quivered with hesitation. Daniel didn't move, didn't pull, he simply waited. The leash remained slack in his hands, a silent reassurance. The decision had to be the shepherd's. He had to want this. Rebecca watched from the porch, her heart pounding. She had seen dogs shut down before, completely overwhelmed by the world they had never been allowed to experience. She knew one wrong move could send him bolting back into the safety of the yard, undoing all the progress they had fought so hard for. For a long moment, the shepherd just stood there, his breathing deep and uneven. Everything in him was screaming to retreat. But then, a breeze stirred the trees around them, carrying something new. A scent, a whisper of something beyond his fear. His nose twitched, curiosity flickering in his eyes. His ears perked. One paw lifted, and then he took a step forward. Rebecca gasped softly, covering her mouth. Another step. Daniel remained still, barely daring to breathe. He knew what this moment meant. The shepherd's movements were slow, cautious, but he was moving. His tail was still low, his muscles tight with anxiety, but he wasn't stopping. His paws met the pavement beyond the yard for the first time in his life. The street was quiet, but to the shepherd, it must have felt like a new world entirely. The ground was different beneath his feet, not dirt, not grass, but something harder, smoother. The air smelled of distant places he had never known, tinged with hints of life beyond his past. His body remained tense, every sense heightened, but he wasn't panicking. He was processing. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's it, you're doing it." The shepherd flicked his ears toward the sound of his voice. His breathing, still heavy, began to slow. He was listening. For the first time he wasn't just reacting, he was choosing. And in that moment, freedom felt real. The shepherd took another step, his paws barely making a sound against the pavement. Every part of him was wired with tension. His tail stayed low, his ears twitched at the slightest noise, and his breath came in short, careful bursts. He was out in the open now, no longer confined by the yard, no longer protected by the fence. For the first time in his life, there was nothing keeping him contained. Daniel could see it in the shepherd's posture. He felt exposed. For years, his world had been predictable, even if it was cruel. The chain had been his prison, but in some twisted way, it had also been his shield. It kept the world at a distance, kept him from facing what lay beyond it. Now that shield was gone. His body trembled, his front paw lifted slightly off the ground, as if he were considering turning back. His eyes darted around, searching for danger, expecting something to go wrong. Then, a car door slammed shut somewhere in the distance. The sound cracked through the quiet, like a gunshot, and the shepherd flinched hard. His entire body tensed, his legs stiffening, ready to bolt. His breath hitched in his throat, and for a second, Daniel saw the fear take over again. The instinct to run. The instinct to survive. Daniel acted fast, but he didn't pull the leash. didn't tighten his grip. Instead, he sank to his knees beside the shepherd, grounding himself, making himself smaller, safer. "You're okay," he said softly. "You're safe." The shepherd's chest heaved, his mind battling between two choices, to flee or to trust. Then, something shifted. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him. His breathing, still quick, began to slow. His eyes, wild with fear just moments ago, softened just a fraction. For the first time, he didn't run from fear. He turned towards safety instead, and he chose to stay. The progress had been slow, but steady. For the past few days, the shepherd had begun exploring beyond the yard, his steps hesitant but growing bolder. Each walk with Daniel was a battle between fear and curiosity, between retreating into old instincts and embracing the unknown. But then it happened. The morning had started like any other. Daniel clipped the leash onto the shepherd's harness, feeling the familiar weight of trust between them. The dog had begun to accept this new ritual, the walks becoming less of a struggle and more of a learning experience. But as they neared the quiet stretch of sidewalk leading to the park, a sudden noise shattered everything. A metal trash can toppled over just a few feet away. The crash was deafening, bouncing off the pavement, sending an explosion of sound into the air. The shepherd froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. His ears flattened, his eyes wide with sheer panic. Then he bolted. Daniel barely had time to react before the shepherd lunged forward, his body fueled by pure survival instinct. The leash snapped tight, the force nearly pulling Daniel off balance. Hey, it's okay." Daniel's voice was steady, but the shepherd wasn't hearing him anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere deep in his past, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. He thrashed against the leash, wild with fear, his breathing sharp and erratic. His claws scraped against the pavement, his body pulling with everything it had, desperate to run, to flee from whatever monster his mind had conjured up. Daniel didn't yank back, didn't try to overpower him. Instead, he dropped to his knees, his grip firm but gentle. "Shadow," he whispered. The name sliced through the panic, a flicker of recognition. Just enough. The shepherd's trembling slowed, his eyes darting to Daniel's face, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak again. He just waited. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, Shadow took a step back. Not away, not toward fear. Toward him. Shadow's entire body trembled as his instincts fought against reality. His eyes darted wildly, his breath shallow, his body caught between the past and the present. For a moment, Daniel thought he might bolt again, dragging both of them into another spiral of panic. But then Shadow's gaze locked onto him. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The shepherd's panic was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but something in him was waiting. Listening, slowly Daniel loosened his grip on the leash, not letting go but easing the tension. It was a test of trust, an unspoken reassurance. You're not trapped. You're not alone. Shadow took a shaky step forward, then another. His body stayed low, ears flat against his head, but he wasn't running anymore. He was choosing to stay. Daniel exhaled the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then a car backfired in the distance. Shadow flinched so hard his claws scraped against the pavement. His tail tucked, his muscles coiled, but he didn't bolt. Instead, he pressed himself against Daniel's leg. It wasn't just an instinctual move, it was deliberate, a choice. Daniel slowly reached out, resting his hand on Shadow's back. The dog tensed, but didn't pull away. It was the first time Shadow had ever actively sought comfort, instead of escaping. Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. This was more than progress. This was a moment that changed everything. For so long Shadow had been running, from his past, from people, from the world itself. But in this moment, faced with fear, he had turned to him. Daniel let his fingers move slowly, running along the shepherd's fur. "Good boy," he whispered. Shadow let out a shaky breath. The fear wasn't gone, not completely, But it had loosened its grip, even if just a little. And for the first time, so had the past. The silence between them felt heavier than the night sky above. Shadow's breath was uneven, his body still tense beneath Daniel's hand, but he didn't pull away. He didn't run. That alone was something Daniel would have never imagined just weeks ago. For a long moment, they stayed like that, still, together, uncertain. Shadow's ears flicked at the distant sounds of the city, and every now and then a tremor passed through him. But he remained pressed against Daniel's leg, a silent plea for something he didn't fully understand yet. Daniel let his hand rest there, unmoving. The warmth of Shadow's fur, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his muscles flexed and relaxed like he was testing his own ability to be close, it was all a miracle. Then Shadow shifted, just slightly. His nose twitched as he lifted his head, his dark eyes searching Daniel's face. There was something different in them, something softer. Daniel didn't dare breathe too hard. If he moved too fast, if he broke whatever fragile balance they had created, it could shatter everything. So he waited, and then Shadow licked his hand. It was barely a flicker of his tongue, just the briefest touch, but it was there. Intentional, chosen. Daniel's throat tightened. After everything Shadow had endured, after years of being treated as nothing more than a chained shadow in the world, he was reaching out. Daniel swallowed the emotions burning in his chest and let out a quiet, steady breath. "You're safe," he whispered. "I promise." Shadow blinked at him. Then slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, and for the first time, it wasn't because he had to. It was because he wanted to. Shadow had taken the first step, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Trust wasn't built overnight, and Daniel knew that every small victory could be followed by setbacks. Yet for the first time, Shadow wasn't just surviving. He was learning to live. Over the next few days, their bond deepened in ways Daniel never expected. Shadow no longer cowered when Daniel entered the room. He didn't flinch at every sudden noise. He was still wary, his instincts finely tuned to a life of pain, but there was something new in his posture, something hopeful. But healing wasn't linear. One evening, as Daniel walked into the room with Shadow's dinner, something triggered the German shepherd's old fears. The clatter of the metal bowl against the table sent Shadow bolting to the corner, his entire body trembling. His ears flattened, his tail tucked tightly beneath him, his eyes filled with sheer panic. Daniel froze, his heart wrenching at the sight. How many times had this dog been beaten? How many times had the sound of metal meant pain, not nourishment? Shadow wasn't here with him in that moment. He was trapped in the past. Daniel crouched down, making himself smaller, softer. He spoke in a whisper, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It's okay, Shadow. You're safe. No one's going to hurt you ever again." Minutes passed. Shadow didn't move, but his trembling slowed. His breathing evened out. Then, ever so hesitantly, he lifted his head. The trust they had built had cracked, but it wasn't broken. And as Shadow took a slow, reluctant step toward Daniel, the man knew that this wasn't just about saving a dog anymore. This was about teaching him that love was real. The moment had finally arrived. Shadow had grown stronger. His fur was no longer matted. His ribs were no longer as pronounced, and his eyes, once lifeless, now held a flicker of something new. But there was one final test. He had never left the safety of the house. The outside world was an unknown monster, filled with sounds, smells, and unpredictable dangers. Every time Daniel opened the door, Shadow would stand at a distance, ears twitching, his muscles tensing. He wanted to go out. He just didn't know how. That morning, Daniel decided to try. He picked up the leash. Shadow saw it, and immediately his entire body stiffened. The chain, the prison, the past. It wasn't just a leash to him, it was a symbol of his suffering. Daniel didn't force it. He placed it gently on the ground and sat beside it, waiting. Minutes passed. Shadow's breathing was shallow, his mind clearly at war. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he took a step forward. His nose quivered as he sniffed the leash, his eyes darting to Daniel, searching for reassurance. Daniel smiled. It's different now, buddy. You're free. Another step, then another, and then Shadow did something that shattered every barrier. He lowered his head and nudged the leash toward Daniel. It wasn't submission, it wasn't fear, it was trust. Daniel's hands trembled as he clipped it on. The door opened. The world awaited. But would Shadow take that step? The open door felt like a portal to another world, one that Shadow had been locked away from his entire life. The sun stretched its golden arms into the doorway, inviting him forward, but his paws remained glued to the floor. Daniel knelt beside him, his voice gentle but firm. It's okay, buddy. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Shadow's ears flicked back, listening, calculating. He took a deep breath, his body trembling as he inched forward. One paw crossed the threshold, then another. The moment his pads touched the cold concrete of the front porch, his breathing hitched, his head whipped around, scanning every inch of the open space in front of him. The sky was too big. The air was too sharp. It was overwhelming. Then a gust of wind, the scent of grass, damp soil, and something unfamiliar yet strangely inviting. Freedom. But with freedom came fear. The sounds of the outside world crashed into him. A distant car horn, a dog barking down the street, the rustling of leaves. His legs locked, his tail tucked instinctively. His mind was screaming, telling him to run back inside, back to the cage, the chains, the pain he understood. Because even suffering was predictable. Daniel didn't move. He didn't tug the leash or force Shadow forward. He simply stood, his presence steady, unwavering. Shadow turned his head toward him, searching for answers, and in that moment, something shifted. This man had never hurt him. He had never shouted, never raised a hand, never forced him to obey out of fear. The weight of the past still clung to Shadow's soul, but in Daniel's steady gaze there was something stronger, safety. And so Shadow did something he had never done before. He stepped forward, not because he had to, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to. Shadow's paws pressed into the damp grass, the unfamiliar texture sending a shiver through his body. For the first time in his life, he was outside, not just peering through rusted metal bars, but actually there, standing beneath the open sky. Yet every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of confinement. Daniel stood a few steps ahead, his hand lightly gripping the leash, not pulling, just waiting. His patience was something Shadow didn't understand. All his life people had demanded, commanded, punished, but this was different. Daniel wasn't forcing him. He was offering him a choice. Shadow's body tensed as a bird suddenly fluttered from a nearby bush. His ears pinned back, his breath shallow and quick. Everything out here was unpredictable. The wind carried scents he couldn't recognize. The distant hum of traffic sent nervous jolts through his muscles, and the vastness of it all made him feel small, vulnerable. He took another step, then hesitated. Could he really do this? Was he even meant for this world? Daniel crouched down, his voice steady, warm. I know it's scary, buddy, but you're not alone. Shadow's eyes locked onto his. Not alone. That thought struck something deep within him. For years he had been alone, forgotten, unwanted. Now there was someone here, someone who saw him, who waited for him, who cared. The chain around his past was still heavy, but for the first time it loosened, just a little. Then cautiously, Shadow took another step forward. Just as Shadow took another hesitant step into the unknown, a sudden noise shattered the fragile moment. A metal trash can clattered to the ground across the street, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Shadow's body reacted before his mind could catch up. His muscles locked, his breath hitched, and his instincts took over. Run, escape, hide. His heart pounded in his chest, his paws stumbling backward, nearly tangling in the leash. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out. The open world, which had seemed vast and new just moments ago, suddenly became a place of terror. The old fear clawed its way back up, whispering that freedom was dangerous, that stepping outside his cage meant pain, punishment. But before he could bolt, before panic swallowed him whole, a steady hand pressed against his side. Daniel. His voice was calm, unwavering. It's okay. It's okay. You're safe. Shadow's breathing was rapid, uneven. His body trembled, but Daniel didn't pull, didn't force. He just stayed there, letting Shadow feel his presence, his warmth. For the first time in his life, Shadow wasn't alone in his fear. The leash didn't tighten. It didn't yank him back into submission like before. Instead, it remained loose, offering freedom, not restraint. Shadow had a choice: run or stay. His legs quivered, his instincts screamed. But then, slowly, painfully, he took a breath. A deep, shaky inhale. The world was still big, still scary. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't all bad. And for the first time, instead of running, Shadow chose to stay. That night, Shadow lay curled on the soft dog bed Daniel had placed for him in the corner of the living room. It was warm, comfortable, nothing like the cold, hard ground he had been used to for years. But still, sleep wouldn't come. His ears twitched at every tiny sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustling of trees outside, the occasional distant bark of another dog. His body remained tense, coiled like a spring, ready to defend itself from dangers that no longer existed. Every time his eyes closed, shadows of the past crept in: the relentless clinking of chains, the hollow echo of his own breathing in an empty, lonely space, the sharp bite of hunger gnawing at his ribs. His mind couldn't comprehend this new world yet, a world where food appeared without struggle, where a soft voice didn't bring pain but reassurance. Suddenly, he lifted his head. A dream, a memory, he wasn't sure. But for a split second, he felt the sensation of the chain tightening around his neck again. Panic surged through his chest, and before he could think, his paws scrambled against the floor. His breathing grew fast, erratic. He had to get out. Then, a voice: "Hey buddy, you okay?" Daniel. He was sitting on the couch, rubbing sleep from his eyes. No shouting, no anger, no punishment, just concern, just warmth. Shadow's breath slowed, just a little. He didn't understand this yet, this strange human who kept showing kindness, even when he failed, even when his past refused to let go. Daniel reached a hand out, not to grab, not to force, just to be there. Shadow hesitated, but then, for the first time, he moved toward it. Just an inch, just enough. And for that night, it was enough. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the living room. Shadow had barely slept, his body still adjusting to this unfamiliar freedom. But even as exhaustion weighed on him, his mind remained alert, constantly scanning for danger. Daniel sat across the room, sipping his coffee, watching Shadow carefully, not with expectation, not with pressure, but with patience. Every movement he made was slow, deliberate, careful not to startle the dog who had known only cruelty. Then Daniel stood up. Shadow tensed, his muscles locked, his breathing hitched. The instinct to flinch, to shrink back into himself, was overwhelming. But Daniel didn't come closer. Instead, he simply walked into the kitchen and returned with a bowl of food. The smell of fresh chicken and kibble filled the air, but Shadow hesitated. He had learned long ago that food wasn't always given freely. Sometimes it came with a cost, a demand, a punishment for taking too long, or worse, a trap. Daniel placed the bowl a few feet away and sat back down, making no move to force Shadow forward. No commands, no expectations, just time. Minutes passed. Shadow's stomach growled, but still, he didn't move. His mind warred with itself. The hunger was there, deep and gnawing, but so was the fear. Then, cautiously, Shadow took a step. One shaky, uncertain step, then another. His heart pounded in his chest as he neared the food, waiting for the pain that never came. He sniffed, then finally, hesitantly, took a bite. The taste flooded his senses. Real food, warm, filling, but more than that, it came with no consequence, no chain, no raised voice, just silence, just peace. For the first time, he ate without fear. Shadow finished his meal, licking the bowl clean, but his body remained tense. Every bite had been swallowed, with the lingering fear that it might be his last. Years of neglect had taught him that nothing good lasted forever. The warmth of a full stomach was unfamiliar, unsettling even, as if it was some cruel trick he had yet to understand. Daniel watched from across the room, never moving too fast, never making sudden gestures. He could see the battle raging inside Shadow, a war between hunger and trust, instinct and fear. He understood that healing wasn't instant. It was built in moments, in gestures that seemed small but carried the weight of the past. Then something unexpected happened. Shadow didn't retreat. He didn't bolt to the farthest corner or curl up in a tight ball as he had before. Instead, he simply stood there, watching, waiting. Daniel exhaled slowly and reached out, not toward Shadow, not yet. Instead, he laid his hand palm up on the floor between them, offering a choice, not a command. He didn't speak, didn't coax. He simply waited. Shadow stared at the hand, his ears flicked back, muscles coiled, his breath shallow. His mind screamed at him to run, but something held him in place. This was different. No leash, no heavy hands forcing him into submission. Just an open hand, waiting. The seconds stretched, and then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow moved forward. A single step, another. His breath came quicker, nostrils flaring. His nose hovered just above Daniel's fingers, sniffing, testing. Then, as if expecting pain, he flinched away. But no blow came, no harsh grip, only silence. Shadow's chest rose and fell, as he stood there, uncertain, caught between terror and longing. And then, with a shuddering breath, he took another step forward. Shadow's breath was uneven, his body rigid with hesitation. The room was silent, except for the soft rhythm of his panting, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The open hand before him did not move, did not demand. It simply waited. A small offering of something he had never truly known: patience. For the first time in his life, there was no leash forcing him forward, no cruel grip yanking him into submission. This was different. It was unfamiliar, and that terrified him. Yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of curiosity. Daniel remained still, resisting every urge to rush this moment. He could see the way Shadow's muscles tensed and relaxed in intervals, as if he were fighting a battle within himself. He had seen this before, in dogs who had known nothing but survival. They wanted to believe in kindness, but the scars of the past still whispered warnings. Then, it happened. Shadow inched closer, his head lowering as his nose hovered just above Daniel's fingers. His whiskers twitched, nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar scent. There was no trace of aggression, no hidden threat, just warmth. And then, as if against his own instincts, Shadow pressed his cold, damp nose against Daniel's hand. It was brief, a flickering moment that could have been missed in the span of a heartbeat. But for Shadow, it was monumental. He had spent years recoiling from hands that hurt him, avoiding touch as if it were poison. Yet, here he was, choosing, even if only for a second, to trust. Daniel didn't react, didn't move too quickly. He simply let Shadow's choice be his own. Shadow pulled back almost immediately, as if realizing what he had done, his ears flattening, his body shrinking. But Daniel still didn't move, didn't grab for him, didn't try to take more than what was given. He only smiled. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You can take all the time you need." Shadow's golden brown eyes studied him for a long moment. Then, ever so slowly, he sat down. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was the first step. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time in his life, Shadow stood outside, unchained, not forced, not dragged, but free. His paws pressed hesitantly into the dewy grass, a texture so foreign that he lifted one paw, as if unsure whether to trust the ground beneath him. Daniel watched from a few feet away, the leash loose in his hands, not restraining, just present, a safety net, not a prison. Shadow's ears twitched as a bird darted overhead, his head jerking up to follow its movement. Instinct pulled at him, run, chase, explore, but fear held him back. He had spent years confined to one miserable spot, his world reduced to the length of a rusted chain. The concept of movement, of space, of possibilities, it was overwhelming. Then, a step, just one, a single paw forward, his nose dipping low to investigate the earth, as though it might vanish beneath him. Then another step, his muscles tensed, prepared for the sharp yank of a chain, the sting of metal biting into his neck. But nothing came. Daniel remained still, his heart pounding, as he held his breath. He knew what this moment meant. It wasn't just a walk, it was the first taste of real freedom. Shadow took another step, then another, and then, as if something inside him clicked, he moved. Not fast, not running, just walking, his head lowered, sniffing the world he had never been allowed to know. His paws touched earth, leaves, gravel, textures of a life beyond confinement. Daniel didn't call him, didn't push. He simply walked beside him, step for step. Shadow turned his head slightly, glancing up at the man who had given him this moment. For the first time, his tail gave the smallest wag, not out of submission, not out of fear, but something else entirely. Something new, something like hope. Shadow's cautious steps became more confident as he walked beside Daniel. The vast openness of the world still felt unnatural to him. But for the first time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, in fear of being yanked back into pain. The sky above was endless, the air filled with scents he had never been allowed to explore. Then a sudden sound, a sharp crack of a twig beneath Daniel's boot. Shadow flinched. His body instinctively crouched low, ears flattened, tail tucked tight against his belly. His entire body trembled, bracing for a blow that never came. Daniel stopped, kneeling down slowly. He reached out his hand, but not to grab or force. He simply waited, a silent invitation. Shadow's breath was shaky, his dark eyes locked on Daniel's open palm. A test of trust. He had seen hands before, ones that hurt, ones that chained, ones that punished, but this hand had only ever been kind. The seconds stretched on, an internal war raging within the dog's mind. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to prepare for pain. But something in Daniel's patient gaze whispered something else. Safety. Slowly, Shadow inched forward. His nose hovered just above Daniel's hand, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent. Familiar now, a presence that had come to mean food, warmth, and something new. Something that felt like care. Then, in a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, Shadow pressed his muzzle against Daniel's palm. A touch that lasted only a heartbeat, but it meant everything. Daniel didn't move, didn't push. He just let Shadow decide. And for the first time, Shadow made a choice. Not out of fear, but out of trust. The days passed, and little by little, Shadow started to change. The once broken, timid creature had begun to show glimmers of something Daniel had feared he might never see: joy. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. The scars on Shadow's body were nothing compared to the ones on his mind. Fear had been his only companion for so long, but now, something new was taking its place. One evening, Daniel sat in the backyard, watching Shadow from a distance. The dog still carried himself cautiously, but there was a difference in the way he moved. Less shrinking, more exploring. His ears, once permanently flattened, perked slightly as he sniffed the cool evening air. Then, the moment that made Daniel's heart nearly stop. A ball, simple, worn, something Daniel had brought home weeks ago, hoping for this exact moment, lay just a few feet from Shadow. And then it happened. Shadow nudged it, just once, a tiny, hesitant tap with his nose. Daniel held his breath. Would he retreat? Would the ghosts of his past take over again? But Shadow didn't move away. Instead, he stared at the ball, his muscles tense with indecision. Something inside him wrestled between fear and the unknown possibility of play. He lowered his head and nudged the ball again. This time, a little harder. Daniel's hands tightened into fists, not out of frustration, but out of sheer, overwhelming emotion. This was it. The first real sign that Shadow wasn't just surviving anymore. Then, in a move so small and yet so powerful, Shadow lifted a paw and placed it on the ball. His tail twitched, a hesitant wag. Daniel's throat tightened. It was happening. Shadow looked up at him, eyes wide, as if asking permission. As if asking, "Is this okay?" Daniel didn't say a word. He just smiled and lightly rolled the ball back toward Shadow. And for the first time in his life, Shadow made a choice that had nothing to do with fear. He chased it. The sound of Shadow's paws against the grass sent a ripple through Daniel's chest, pure, unfiltered emotion. He had seen dogs play before, but never had something so simple felt so profound. This wasn't just a game. This was freedom. Shadow stopped the ball with his front paws, then nudged it back toward Daniel, his movement still uncertain but growing bolder with every second. It was as if he was discovering his own body for the first time, learning what it meant to move without the weight of fear pressing down on him. Daniel could hardly believe his eyes. This was the same dog that had once flinched at the sound of a rustling leaf, the same dog that wouldn't step out of his corner for days. And now he was playing, and then something happened that Daniel hadn't dared to hope for. Shadow barked. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't aggressive. It was short, almost surprised, like he hadn't expected his own voice. Daniel felt his chest tighten. This was the first time he had ever heard Shadow bark. The dog stood still for a moment, ears flicking, tail hesitating. Then, as if testing his own courage, he let out another bark, this time stronger. Daniel laughed, and Shadow's ears perked up at the sound. Something clicked between them. "You're free now," Daniel whispered, though he knew Shadow couldn't understand the words, but maybe, just maybe, he could feel them. Shadow dropped into a play bow, an unmistakable sign. He wasn't just existing anymore, he was living. The days that followed were nothing short of miraculous. Shadow no longer lingered by the door, afraid to step outside. He no longer hesitated when Daniel reached out to him. The fear that had once consumed him was melting away, replaced by something even stronger, trust. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Daniel sat on the porch, watching Shadow chase after a butterfly. The same dog that had once been too afraid to lift his head was now bounding through the yard, ears flopping, eyes bright with joy. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. This was what he had dreamed of for Shadow. A life where fear didn't control him. A life where he was free. Shadow ran up to Daniel, panting, his eyes filled with something unrecognizable from before, happiness. He placed his head on Daniel's lap, a quiet moment between them that needed no words. Daniel ran his fingers through Shadow's fur, feeling the warmth of a dog that had finally learned what it meant to be loved. And then, as if to seal everything that had happened between them, Shadow did something that made Daniel's breath catch. He lifted his paw and placed it on Daniel's hand, an unspoken thank you, a bond that couldn't be broken. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're home, buddy." Shadow's tail wagged. He understood. For the first time in his life, he knew he was finally where he belonged.